Hello, and welcome to this video on careers in international organisations. This is a two-part series, and in this first video I'm going to talk about understanding international organisations, who they are, what they need, and where you can find them. And then in the second video of the series, I'm going to talk a little bit more about understanding yourself and where you might fit within that broader framework. So, who are they? Well, there are different definitions of international organisations, but here's the one I'm using for the purposes of this video. There can be intergovernmental organisations, so famous ones you will have heard of are probably the EU, the UN, but there can be some others as well. So ASEAN, for example, here is the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations. EBRD is the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and that you often see these sorts of acronyms being used, so they can be a little bit confusing until you get used to them. Some of them are kind of completely global in their reach, but some of them can be more regional. Then in a similar sort of space, we get NGOs working. Now, NGOs can be quite local in their focus, but the ones with an international focus, and I've listed some you may be familiar with here, are also, of course, a type of international organisation, and they can work in some cases quite closely with the IGOs as well. And then finally we have think tanks and research institutes. Again, these can be local in their focus, but some of them are international in their focus, and if you want to work in this sort of area, you might consider working for them as well. Northwestern University has got a really comprehensive list of international organisations, including some quite small, quite niche ones you may not have considered or may not have heard of, and it's worth having a look to get a clearer picture. What do they do? Well, broadly, they're coming together, at least 3 sovereign nations is one commonly agreed definition, in order to do something which has some kind of international relevance. So that might be peacekeeping and military concerns, it could be political and diplomatic, international trade or economic agreements, things like security and international crime, particularly where it crosses borders. So we might think here about drugs trafficking or human trafficking. And that leads us naturally perhaps into talking about human rights and those issues of migration and immigration. Then we've got those concerns which can affect countries all over the world, so things like climate change, environmental damage and sustainability, technology, and that's increasingly becoming something of a global concern because it's connecting countries so much more closely, and public health, which you can imagine has had a particular focus since the COVID-19 pandemic. They're doing this work because some sort of international cooperation or action is important or significant. That can be providing some kind of expertise, maybe pooling data or information so that people can monitor trends more effectively, or so that countries can benefit from expertise that they don't hold themselves but exists in a different place. It might be around delivering services and aid, maybe to a country that has a particular need at the moment because of a natural disaster, or because historically they don't have the resources and infrastructure to be able to meet some of the needs of their population. It can provide forums for bargaining or settling disputes or negotiations, and they can also act as instruments of foreign policy, perhaps legitimising a certain course of action by getting several countries to agree on it, or maybe constraining the behaviour of a state where it's considered by one group of countries that that might not be an appropriate and useful course of action. And both of those things can be controversial at times. When I talk to students, they're often thinking about the sorts of roles in international organisations that concern human rights or legal matters, policy and research concerns, advocacy, maybe speaking out for particular marginalised populations, the environment, sustainability. Finance can be an important one for places like the World Bank and other large international banks, and public health, as I mentioned. But of course, there are a huge number of roles that need to be done by all international organisations and for international organisations. So something like human resources that you can see in this list, just if you have a large complex organisation, someone somewhere needs to be keeping an eye on that and understanding and managing how it works. So there really is a hugely diverse and complex list of different jobs that people might be doing. That can make it quite difficult to say what qualities are generally needed for work in international organisations. You can imagine that an engineer's set of skills might be quite different than somebody who's working in audit, for example. But what we can say is that they're large and complex organisations that are staffed by people from lots of different backgrounds. So having a good understanding of cross-cultural communication is really important. Alongside that, language skills are valued so that communication can be a little easier, as well as diplomatic and negotiation skills. Now, of course, there are some roles where diplomacy is the main thing that you'll be doing every day, but in every role, I think it's important to understand the nature of diplomacy and how that can affect the work that you're doing. Alongside that, being able to cope with ambiguity, having strategies to manage that as best you can. And it's incredibly important that you behave ethically, that you meet the accountability and integrity standards of an organisation of this type. Project management and organisational logistical skills, again, that will be more important in some jobs than others, but it's useful to have those because quite a lot of different roles will involve managing a project of some kind. Some knowledge of international law or politics, even where that's not your specialism. And in many roles, having some good understanding of analytical and research skills and digital and data skills can be really helpful. I often get asked about whether or not a master's is necessary to work in international organisations, and it's a slightly complex picture. For a permanent job with a UN agency or many other of the larger intergovernmental organisations, you do often need a master's. But for example, you don't need a master's to intern with a UN body. You can intern within a year of getting a master's or an undergraduate degree. For things like NGOs, some of them, the larger ones which work internationally, it might be quite common to have a master's to work there, but it's not always a necessity. The other thing to think about if you're facing this decision of whether or not to do a master's is to think about whether or not that's something you want to do immediately after your undergraduate studies, or whether you'd like to get a little bit more work experience, perhaps to help you decide which master's degree would be most useful. And it can be helpful to specialise in a particular area through your master's study. It's not essential, not everyone does that, but it can be a really useful thing to do. And sometimes people need a little bit of work experience first to help them decide whether or not they want to specialise in one area over another. We have got a video where one of our students is talking to one of our alumni about just this issue, and I recommend you have a look at that. Okay, going into a little bit more detail. On the right here, you can see that there are particular years of work experience that you need to work at different levels. So down the side where it says D2, D1, P5, P4, P3, P2, that's the different pay grades, and this is for the UN Secretariat, but I'm using it as an illustration. You'll find similar things at quite a lot of intergovernmental organisations. This is given for people who have a master's degree. So technically, if you have a master's degree and you go in at P2 level, you would be expected to have 2 years of full-time relevant work experience. However, technically, if you have a PhD, you can reduce that expected work experience by 2 years, meaning you could go in, you would be eligible to go in at P2 level with no work experience. If you have an undergraduate degree, then technically you could go in, but you'd be expected to have an extra 2 years work experience. So at P2 level, that would look like an undergraduate degree with 4 years. However, whilst it says that technically that's possible in the descriptions, and I've put that up on the side so you can see what it looks like, it's important to recognise that actually many people working at these levels have got quite a lot of more work experience than that. These are hugely competitive roles, and you can be up against people who have got a lot more than it says on paper. So keep in mind that the average age of someone working at P2 level is 37. The average age of someone working at P3 level is 44. So whilst these are technical minimums, the reality is it's important to get as much relevant work experience as you can before going for these sorts of direct entry level roles. You can see the language requirements are there as well. Everyone who's studied or is an alum of Cambridge University should have an excellent command of a working language, which is English, because of course that's the language we work in, so you should meet that. You'll see similar language requirements at other international organisations as well. So let's look at a few entry points. I'm sometimes asked, do these sorts of international organisations have graduate schemes? And the answer is no, not really, but what lots of them have is some version of a young professionals programme, which is often called YPP. I've listed just some of them here, and the current requirements for them are on the right, so do pause the video and take a closer look at those, but do also check with the hosting organisation that those requirements haven't changed, because this is only kind of up to date at the point that the video was recorded. For many of them, they're going to require you to have citizenship of one of the member nations, and most of them will have a language requirement, including fluency, often in English, which, as I said, for our students and graduates should be a fairly straightforward requirement to meet. Some of them have an age or experience requirement, and this can be both a minimum and a maximum. So sometimes they're aimed at people who are young, who are junior. You know, this is aimed at people as an entry-level position, so they might have an age under which they want you to be. So for example, for the UN YPP, they want people to be under 32. But for some other positions, they do like people to have a little bit more work experience and life experience, and they might, for example, say they want people over the age of 25. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the UN YPP because it's got some distinctive features, one of which is that national eligibility varies from year to year. They look at making a requirement based on how many people are working for the UN of a certain nationality. Generally, they're trying to get a balance of people from different nationalities who are from UN states who are working there, so it's representative. So some countries appear on the YPP programme several times because there's an ongoing issue where not quite enough people from that country are working for the UN, so they're constantly working to try and boost those numbers. Some other countries go on and off the next year because the numbers have been boosted enough. So you do need to check that list of eligibility every year. It is very strict, there's no movement on it. The YPP is only for people who are listed for that particular nationality in any given year. The other thing to know about this programme is that if you're successful, you don't immediately and automatically get a job. You're placed on a roster for jobs, which says essentially, look, we've recruited these people, we know they'd be good to work for the UN, they're from a nationality which we're trying to increase our staffing from, please consider them for any jobs that are available. And then if one of the UN bodies does have a position that they think would be suitable for you, they call you up. You don't need to go through any more recruitment, you've done that already, and you start work. But it can happen that you go onto the roster and no suitable jobs come up, and you will just go off the roster at the end of the time, and that's it, you've never actually worked for them. So it's worth knowing that before you apply. There are some other little quirks that are worth knowing about for the UN. One is that they have a particular recruitment stream for people who are interested in translation and interpreting work, and I recommend you have a look at our video on translation and interpreting, which is a really good one. Volunteers are slightly, perhaps unusually, or you might not expect, paid an allowance. So although it's a voluntary role, you shouldn't be out of pocket. Your allowance will cover all of your expenses. You have to be 25 years or older. There's no upper age limit. You do need to have a university degree and at least 2 years of relevant work experience in a professional background and good working knowledge of English, French or Spanish. They're normally 6 to 12-month positions. Internships tend to be a little bit shorter, more like 2 to 6 months. They're open to people in the final year of their degree or the year after their degree, and that's a bachelor's, master's or PhD, it doesn't matter. Traditionally, they have been unpaid positions, and that's included things like funding your own visa and funding your own travel expenses. So you could well be out of pocket if you choose to do a UN internship. That's changing a little bit, and increasingly some of the UN bodies are starting to offer some kind of allowance or stipend similar to the volunteer position, but it's worth checking those carefully because it's not all of them by any means. The UN internships are really popular, and you can imagine the New York headquarters is the most popular. They're always inundated with applications. Summer is also the most popular time to apply for an internship, so to be a bit more competitive, you might want to consider field offices rather than headquarters, and if it's possible for you to work out with the timing, perhaps applying not in the summer straight after graduation, but leaving it a little bit longer and maybe applying some months later where it might be a bit less competitive than it was. All UN positions are funded by the member states, and there really is an understanding amongst people working for the UN and providing these internships that it's not ideal. Many people are just not in the position to be able to work unpaid for that length of time. However, it's really difficult because if they want to fund an internship, they've got to get that funding from somewhere. And currently the Netherlands funds its internships, but if the other member states simply won't do it, then there's nowhere the UN can go with that. It's worth noting that one of the sort of outcomes of the fact they've started funding them or funding them up to a certain extent, it's not a full salary, but this allowance, may be that they're not able to offer so many internships, which could in turn make them even more competitive, unfortunately. The JPO programme, as it's known, is a Junior Professional Officer programme, and these are positions sort of, again, aimed at the entry level, selected and sponsored by your own government typically, although some governments support applicants from other developing countries which may not be in a position to fund their own JPO programmes. It's usually a 2 or 3 year programme. Some of them specify that they want applicants to be under the age of 32, but not all of them. It's usually aimed to be at about that P1, P2 level that we talked about, and therefore usually there are requirements around having that master's degree with at least 2 years relevant work experience or the equivalent. Finally, consultancies sound really formal, but actually within the UN this just means sort of a temporary contract. You don't necessarily need what you might consider a sort of consultant level of experience or background. You can sometimes move on to a consultancy after an internship. Here are some useful websites where you can find vacancies. A word of warning here that because international organisations are such a popular area that people want to work for, there can be examples of scammers, fake sites, people really advertising something that isn't legitimate, so we would encourage you to always check any website carefully. The UN advertises its vacancies through the UN careers page, which is the top one there. The one underneath is UNV, that's the UN volunteers page, and then you go through the Inspira portal, which I've also listed to actually apply. EPSO beneath that is the European Personnel Selection Office, so that's the EU equivalent, it's their own vacancy site, and the European Youth Portal is well worth a look. Many of the international organisations and intergovernmental bodies will have their own careers pages on their own website, so if you look up something like the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development and go to their vacancies or their careers page, you'll find their vacancies listed there. Underneath that, I've listed some sites which have got positions not necessarily for those big international intergovernmental organisations, but with some smaller bodies or the NGOs or other sorts of organisations that work alongside the sort of the big names, as it were. Some of these are a little bit more development focused, but it's well worth having a look through those and finding out what's available at any one time. We've also got Going Global, which is a resource that can be accessed by Cambridge students and alumni, which will help you learn about the possibilities of working in different countries, what their recruitment processes are, and they also list some NGOs and organisations working more locally in those countries as well. So it's well worth having a look at that. Join me in our second video where we'll talk in a bit more detail about understanding yourself, where you might fit and how to stand out in applications when you get to that point.